Gymnastics is one of the most demanding sports in the world. The athletes who reach its highest levels have spent years, sometimes their entire childhoods, learning to do things the human body was never designed to do. They spin through the air at speed. They catch bars with their bare hands. They trust their bodies to land in exactly the right position every single time. Most of the time they do, but the margin between a perfect landing and a catastrophic one is razor thin. A fraction of a second, a slight miscalculation, a foot that slips where it shouldn't. The sport asks everything of those who compete in it, and sometimes it takes everything in return. These aren't stories about recklessness. They're stories about athletes who were doing exactly what they had trained to do and what the sport demanded of them. Some of them were failed by the people responsible for their safety. Some were failed by systems that treated their bodies as instruments rather than lives. Some were failed by nothing more specific than the sport's unforgiving arithmetic. Here are 5 more terrifying gymnastics deaths. Elena Mukhina was born in Moscow in 1960, and she was, by almost any measure, one of the most gifted gymnasts the Soviet Union had ever produced. She won the all-around at the 1978 World Championships in Strasbourg, beating both Nadia Comaneci and Nelly Kim. She was 20 years old. The 1980 Moscow Olympics were 2 years away, and everyone expected her to be at the center of them. What happened instead was a slow, grinding tragedy that unfolded over years, driven by a system that valued medals over the people earning them. It started in 1979, when Mukhina broke her leg during training. The fracture didn't heal properly because the doctors at the national team's medical institute removed her cast too soon, against her own protests. She later described begging them not to discharge her, saying she knew she was walking wrong, that something wasn't right. They sent her back to train anyway. A coach appeared at her hospital bed the day after surgery and told her she could still train in a cast. At the same time, her coach Mikhail Klimenko was pushing her to add a new element to her floor routine, the Thomas Salto. It was a move borrowed from men's gymnastics, a 1.5 backflip with 1.5 twists that had to end in a forward roll. The timing required was almost impossibly narrow. Too little height and she'd land on her chin. Too much rotation and she'd land on the back of her head. Mukhina knew this. She said so, repeatedly. In a 1991 documentary, she reflected on those months. I had said more than once that I would break my neck doing that element. I had hurt myself badly several times, but he just replied, people like me don't break their necks. But Klimenko wasn't there on July 3, 1980. He had left the pre-Olympic training camp at the Minsk Palace of Sport the day before to travel to Moscow, reportedly to tell officials that Mukhina had mastered the Thomas Salto. She hadn't. Another coach at the camp, with the Olympics 2 weeks away, told her to run a full-floor exercise with complete difficulty anyway. She under-rotated the salto. She landed on her chin. 3 vertebrae in her spine fractured. She was paralyzed from the neck down. The Soviet response was to cover it up. State newspapers reported she had fallen off the balance beam and briefly blacked out before finishing her floor routine. Other reports said she was recovering well and could stand. It wasn't until October 1981 that Pravda, the state newspaper, finally acknowledged she had been paralyzed performing the Thomas Salto. Mukhina spent the next 26 years in a wheelchair. She graduated from university, wrote columns, gave rare interviews in which she described the Soviet gymnastics machine with a clarity that was both generous and unsparing. She said she felt sorry for Klimenko, that he was a victim of the same system that had broken her. But she also said, I was injured because everyone around me was observing neutrality and keeping silent. She died on December 22, 2006, at the age of 46. The cause was heart failure. The Thomas Salto was eventually removed from the women's code of points entirely. In 2017, it was removed from the men's code as well. The move that Mukhina had begged her coach to let her stop performing no longer exists as a legal skill in competitive gymnastics at any level. The sport erased it, 26 years too late. It was May 2021 in Cameroon. The African Gymnastics Championships were days away. Severine Jala Abak was 21 years old. a member of the Cameroonian national gymnastics team, preparing for the trip to Cairo for the Continental Championships. She had been competing internationally since 2018, when she made her debut at the African Championships at 18 years old, qualifying to the vault final by being one of only 6 gymnasts completing 2 vaults. The following year, at the 2019 African Games, she made the finals on both vault and beam, finishing 8th and 7th respectively. She was young, developing, and the championships ahead were the kind of stage where careers take shape. On May 17, 2021, during a training session, Jala Abak fell from the uneven bars. She fractured her neck. The emergency surgery that followed was initially considered a success. She regained consciousness. She became alert enough to receive teammates and, in a final act that speaks to who she was, she asked to visit them before they departed for Cairo, so she could wish them luck in the competition she would not be attending. The team left. The championships went ahead. Then, shockingly and without warning, Séverine Jala Abak died. The circumstances of her death drew attention not only to the tragedy itself, but to a structural gap that the gymnastics world had been reluctant to examine directly. The Gymnastics publication, the Gymternet, described it as a moment that revealed the gymnastics resources disparity, the vast difference between what athletes from wealthy gymnastics programs receive in terms of safety infrastructure, medical support, and coaching expertise, and what athletes from developing nations have access to. African gymnastics programs operate without the budgets, specialized equipment, and medical oversight that protect gymnasts in the sport's dominant countries. Accidents that might be caught earlier, prevented by better equipment, or survived through better medical care can have different outcomes depending entirely on where a gymnast happens to train. What the resources disparity looks like in practice is worth being specific about. In the programs that dominate international gymnastics, there are dedicated strength and conditioning coaches, sports psychologists, in-house medical staff, and training halls built to professional standards with properly rated landing surfaces, foam pits, and equipment serviced on regular schedules. There are spotters. There are protocols for when an athlete feels something isn't right. There are people whose entire job is to watch and intervene. In programs operating at the margins of international gymnastics, training often happens in facilities that were not built for the sport, with coaches who are skilled but spread thin, without immediate access to the medical infrastructure that can turn a serious injury into a survivable one. The gap is not a failure of commitment or talent. It is a structural reality that the sport has been slow to examine honestly, in part because the athletes most affected by it rarely become prominent enough to make the gap visible. The uneven bars carry a specific danger that makes them one of the most consequential events in the sport. Dismounts require a gymnast to release the bar at height and orient her body for a blind landing in the fraction of a second between release and ground. When the angle of release is wrong, when a grip fails, when the body position in the air is even slightly off, there is no recovery window. The apparatus was doing exactly what it was designed to do on May 17th. The same could be said for the equipment in facilities around the world. The difference, in cases like Jala Abak's, is what is available afterward. She was, by the standards available to her and her country, an elite athlete. She had crossed the continent to compete. She had made finals. She had done all of it within a program that operated on far fewer resources than the programs she competed against. She died doing what she had done hundreds of times in practice, on an apparatus that gymnastics programs around the world regard as routine. At the 2021 African Championships, which went forward in Cairo while her teammates mourned her, the competition carried what one observer described as a weight unlike any before. Séverine Jala Abak had been there the last time those athletes were all together in a room. She had wished them luck and watched them leave. She was 21 years old. It was February 11th, 1993. Moscow was cold, and the rhythmic gymnastics world had just come off one of its most celebrated seasons. Oxana Costina was 20 years old, the reigning 1992 world all-around champion, and she was engaged to Eduard Zinovka, an athlete who had won the pentathlon bronze medal at the Barcelona Olympics just months before. The two were traveling together that evening, in a car in Moscow. when a lorry coming from the opposite direction crossed into their lane and struck them head-on. Costina died from her injuries 16 hours later. She was 3 months from her 21st birthday. She had been born on April 15, 1972, and had competed since she was a teenager, working her way through the Soviet and then the Russian gymnastics system during one of the most turbulent transitions in sports history. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the athletes and programs that had been built within its structure suddenly had to redefine themselves under new national identities. Costina competed through that disruption, representing a sport that was still being formalized at the international level and a country that was still working out what it was. What made her death so difficult for rhythmic gymnastics to absorb was the timing and the completeness of what she had just achieved. At the 1992 World Championships in Brussels, Costina had won the all-around gold medal, along with gold in rope, hoop, ball, and clubs. She was not just the world champion. She was, in that moment, the undisputed best rhythmic gymnast on Earth. The Olympic Games in Atlanta, 3 years away, represented the next horizon where someone at her level would be expected to compete. None of that came. Zinovka survived the crash. Investigations revealed that he had been driving while heavily intoxicated at the time of the accident. The police reports were direct about this fact. The circumstances added a dimension of preventability to Costina's death that made it harder for the people who had trained with her and watched her compete to make sense of. The world champion of rhythmic gymnastics had not died falling from an apparatus. She had died in a car in Moscow, 16 hours after impact, from injuries that a different decision that evening would have prevented entirely. Rhythmic gymnastics in the early 1990s was still establishing itself as a globally recognized discipline. Costina was among the first generation to compete under the Russian flag after the Soviet dissolution. She had won the world title in Brussels as a representative of the new Russia, and she had done it with a style that coaches and judges noted specifically. Technical precision combined with an expressiveness that the discipline demands and that she produced naturally. Her death in February 1993 left a void the next generation would spend years filling. The Washington Post ran an obituary. The gymnastics community mourned someone who should have had years of competition left. What happened on that Moscow road had nothing to do with sport, with training, with the physical demands the discipline had placed on her. It had everything to do with a car, a lorry, and a decision made behind the wheel. She was 20 years old. The world title she had won in Brussels was less than 5 months old. She had competed at 2 Olympic Games and won medals at both. By the time Vera Čáslavská retired from gymnastics in 1968, she had accumulated more Olympic gold medals in individual events than any other gymnast in history. 7 golds in total: vault, uneven bars, floor exercise, balance beam, individual all around. She had won them across 2 Olympic cycles, at Tokyo in 1964 and Mexico City in 1968, and she had done so with a poise and consistency that made her the face of Czechoslovak gymnastics during a decade when that meant something to the entire world. What happened to her after 1968 was a different story, and it ended on August 30th, 2016. In July 1968, weeks before the Mexico City Olympics were to begin, Čáslavská signed a political manifesto in Czechoslovakia that criticized the Soviet Communist Party's increasing influence over her country. It was called the 2,000 Words Manifesto, and it represented exactly what its title suggested: words put into public record at a moment when doing so carried real consequences. The Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in August 1968, rolling tanks into Prague while Čáslavská was at the Olympic Games in Mexico City winning medals. In one of the most striking images from those games, she bowed her head during the playing of the Soviet national anthem at her award ceremony, a private gesture that was caught on camera and understood by anyone watching. It was, in retrospect, a perfect expression of who she was. She had won 4 Olympic golds at Tokyo in 1964. At age 22, she had won 3 more in Mexico City. She had done it while training through the political turbulence of a country that existed in the shadow of Soviet power. She had competed beautifully and said nothing publicly. And then she had signed her name to a document and bowed her head at a ceremony, and the government had not forgotten either action. She came home to a government that had not forgotten what she had signed. For the years that followed, she was effectively erased from public life in Czechoslovakia. She was not allowed to travel internationally. She was prohibited from coaching or working in gymnastics in any capacity. The sport that had been her entire professional identity was closed to her, not because of any failing on her part, but because she had exercised a conscience in the wrong direction. She worked in manual labor. Contemporaries who had benefited from her influence as a competitor moved into coaching structures and sports administration while she was kept out of all of it. Her personal life reflected the toll. Her son, Radim, committed suicide later in life. Her marriage ended. The depression that settled over her in the years of political isolation was something she spoke about rarely and with visible difficulty when she did. The Velvet Revolution of 1989 brought changes. She was rehabilitated politically and became president of the Czech Olympic Committee in 1990. She was officially honored and remembered as the champion she had been. But the years of exclusion had left marks that no formal rehabilitation could fully undo. Her health declined over the years that followed, and on August 30th, 2016, Vera Čáslavská died of pancreatic cancer. She was 74 years old. Her 7 Olympic gold medals remain a record in individual gymnastics events. What her story revealed was that the system surrounding gymnastics, the political structures and national programs that shaped and controlled careers, could do more sustained damage to a life than any fall from a balance beam. She had mastered the apparatus. She had not been protected from what came after. The sport she had given her life to had no mechanism to protect her from the government that decided what her life was worth. The 1991 World Gymnastics Championships took place in Indianapolis, Indiana, in September. It was a landmark moment for American women's gymnastics, with the United States team winning the silver medal behind the Soviet Union, a result that signaled the program's arrival on the international stage and set expectations for what was coming next. Among the gymnasts on that team was Hilary Grivich. She was young, she was accomplished, and she was part of a program that was producing results at the highest level of international competition at the exact moment when it mattered most. Not long after the championships, she was gone. She was 19 years old, killed in a car accident in Houston, Texas. USA Gymnastics published a notice mourning her as one of their own. Hilary Grivich, 1991, world medalist, killed in car accident. The brevity of that headline reflected what the gymnastics world was left to process. A name attached to a medal that was still new, a career that had just announced itself to the world, and a life that was over before anyone had fully taken stock of it. The manner of it made no sense in the context of what she had just achieved. The World Championships are the second highest stage in gymnastics, the competition just below the Olympic Games, and the silver medal those athletes brought home was a result that reflected years of training and discipline. Grivich had been part of that effort. She had traveled to Indianapolis, competed on that stage, and come home with a medal. The Olympic cycle that had just begun pointed toward Barcelona in 1992 and Atlanta in 1996 as milestones where someone at that stage of development might reasonably expect to compete. None of that came. It is worth understanding what that silver medal actually represented in the broader arc of American gymnastics. The 1991 team was not the arrival. It was the prelude. In the years that followed, the United States women's program would build toward the 1996 Atlanta Games with a different kind of urgency. On home soil, under a level of public pressure the sport had never seen in America. The athletes and coaches who were assembling that future in 1991 were drawing on everything that team in Indianapolis had just proven was possible. A silver medal behind the Soviet Union, in a year when the Soviet Union still existed and was still the benchmark, was a statement. It told the next group of girls coming up through the program that the gap between American gymnastics and the top of the world was closable. Grivich had been part of proving that. She had done it at 19. In the final year, the competition even looked the way it had for the previous 2 decades. That specific proof That specific contribution died with her. The gymnastics community is not large. When someone from a world championship team dies at 19, the people who trained alongside her, who competed against her, who had watched her develop through the junior ranks, feel that loss in a specific and irreversible way. 19 years old at a world championship is not an arrival. It is an opening. It is the point at which the work of years finally becomes visible to the world, and the question shifts from whether someone can reach that level to what they might build once they are there. Hillary Grivich's answer to that question was taken before she could give it. The sport she competed in had given her a silver medal and a place among its elite. What it could not give her was the years that should have followed. USA Gymnastics carries her name on its records. The medal remains. The gymnast does not. She was 19. The medal she had helped win was months old. The sport is built on the belief that enough training, enough repetition, enough trust in the body's memory can carry an athlete through. Most of the time, that belief holds. But Elena Mukhina, Oxana Costina, Vera Čáslavská, and Hillary Grivich each reached a point where the sport, the systems around it, or the world outside it could not hold that belief together. The training halls, the coaching structures, the competition stages, the political systems that surrounded the sport, none of them were built to protect the people inside them from everything. What they share is the simplest and hardest truth in sports. Sometimes, the person who gives everything to the discipline they love is not protected by that love when the moment comes.